Hello and welcome everyone who is here to participate in and be an audience to a talkback, a post-performance talkback to the play Agatha, which is the 2020 honorary play by playwright Angela J. Davis, our honorary playwright. We have a really fine panel today to discuss the play and its context. And then we'll have the moderator, Chloe Roberts, introduce our panelists and will moderate the discussion. Will be online for approximately 1 hour. And we hope that you find this enlightening. And if you have not already seen the play, it is still playing on the PlayFest Santa Barbara YouTube channel until Monday evening. I did not introduce myself. I'm Mike LaGrosse. I'm the Artistic Director of PlayFest Santa Barbara. And our mission, simply put, is to support the development of new plays, the playwrights, and develop audiences for new work. And that's why, after an international competition, we selected this extraordinary play that Angela has written that we hope you have already seen or you will be seeing in a stage reading. I'm going to disappear from the screen now and turn it over to Chloe Roberts.
Thank you, Michael. Hi, everyone. My name is Chloe Roberts. I'm a PhD candidate at UC Santa Barbara in the history department. And I'm so pleased to welcome everyone here today. Thank you so much for tuning in. We are so fortunate during such strange times to have access to forums like this that are working to bring the arts into our homes all across the world. We have people in Europe, people in California joining us today. So earlier this year, as Michael said, PlayFest Santa Barbara selected Agatha and Angela J. Davis as respectively the winning play and playwright from an international pool of new works. The play is incredible and it tells the overlooked story of Agatha Uwilingiyimana, an intriguing woman who served as Rwanda's president for just 14 hours in 1994. And she accomplished a quiet miracle during one of the darkest moments in Rwanda's history. The play received the 2020 New American Voices Award from the Landing Theater and was named a Eugene O'Neill semifinalist among many other prestigious awards. We are joined today by 3 special guests. So first, let me please introduce the playwright herself, Angela J. Davis. Angela's plays include Agatha, which we are discussing today, as well as the Spanish Prayer Book. And was named a Eugene O'Neill semifinalist. I'm hearing myself talk back to myself. There we go, thank you. Her plays include Agatha, as well as the Spanish Prayer Book, which ran for 3 months at the Road Theater Company during the 2019 and 2020 season. It was also an LA Times Best Bet and a Eugene O'Neill semifinalist. Her play Clara and Sarah and the Talking Bear was recently commissioned and produced as a radio play by the Antaeus Theater Company. Thank you so much for joining us, Angela. We're so lucky to have you. Next, we are joined by Professor Patricia Visser-Sellers. She is an international criminal lawyer and the special advisor for gender for the Office of the Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court. She was also instrumental in her work for the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda and Yugoslavia. She is a visiting fellow at Oxford University, where she teaches international criminal and human rights law at the master's level. Thank you so much, Patricia, for joining us today. Our third guest is Terry Bowers, who was previously the United States representative on the Yugoslavia War Crimes Tribunal, known as the ICTY. He was also the legal coordinator for the investigation section of the ICTY, and during his final week there, he gave the opening statement in one of its first genocide trials. He also served as a consultant to the Rwandan War Crimes Tribunal. After serving as the United States Attorney for the Central District of California, the federal district that encompasses 7 counties, including both Los Angeles and Santa Barbara, and 19 million people, he is now in private practice and on the Los Angeles board of the Human Rights Watch. So thank you all so much for joining us today. We are so lucky to have all of you. So today we will be discussing the creation of the play, and we're going to examine some of its major themes, as well as Agatha's legacy, the lasting impact of genocide, and how we will look at Rwanda in 2020. So I would first like to turn to Angela and discuss how you came across this astounding story. So how did you find Agatha? And then what about her story compelled you to write the play? And then also, could you maybe give us just a bit of some contextual information about the Rwandan genocide for some of our audience members who are maybe not as familiar with it?
So let me start with the Rwandan genocide, which was in 1994. And something like estimates vary, but I think it's safe to say that at least 800,000 people were brutally murdered in the span of just a couple of months. Um, I was aware of the genocide when it was happening in 1994, but also 10 years later, the Darfur genocide was unfolding. And also around that time, Samantha Power, somebody that I deeply admire, published a book called A Problem from Hell about the history of the United States responses to various genocides, including the Rwandan genocide. And she and other scholars were remarking on the haunting parallels between the Rwandan genocide and the Darfur genocide. And I went back and took a closer look at the Rwandan genocide. Partly Samantha Power's book had a chapter on it. There's also, of course, Philip Gorovich's writing on the Rwandan genocide. And one of the realities of the Rwandan genocide is that there was sadistic extremes of sexual violence perpetrated, and Patricia was instrumental in getting the criminal court to recognize what we now take for granted, which is that rape is, of course, a crime of genocide. But also I was kind of wondering about women, particular women that maybe I could write about. And Samantha Power's book does mention Agatha Uwilingiyimana in passing. And I kind of was surprised because I hadn't realized at the time that, the person who was second in command, who actually was president after that very consequential plane crash on April 6, 1994, the person who really was supposed to be running the country at that moment was a woman, an academic by training, and also a mother of 5 children. And as I looked a little more closely at her story, I was just hooked. I mean, I was just amazed at her bravery and her prescience. And also another character that really captivates me is Mbaye Diagne, who was the Senegalese colonel, a practicing Muslim who was temporarily assigned to the UN peacekeeping force, and I mean, really was a hero and saved countless lives and is not adequately recognized enough. And also for dramatic potential, I mean, he was just this larger than life kind of comedic personality. And one of the ways in which he saved so many lives was he knew how to bribe a lot of the people at checkpoints and a lot of the guards. Another reason that I wanted to write about the Rwandan genocide is I do think that, and I'm sure Terry and Patricia could say more about this, but I even looking at some of the responsible reporting in the United States, like NPR and the New York Times, which are my information choices, a lot of the reporting characterized the Rwandan genocide as tribal warfare, which kind of sickens me because it's a way of marginalizing the human tragedy, and also it's not really accurate. It was an incredibly well-organized, well thought out, methodical operation. And if you think about it, it had to be for them to wipe out the number of people that they did, and for them to identify those people when the distinctions between the Hutus and the Tutsis were not so obvious. It really was, it was a 20th century genocide. And I think it's important that we remember that.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much. And I'd like to talk a little bit more about what you mentioned at the beginning of your statement about the sexual violence. So I have a specific question for that in a moment, but I'd like to turn next to Patricia. Could you just please share a little bit with us about your experience in Rwanda and your work on the criminal tribunal, and maybe some of your general thoughts about the play and kind of what the story is bringing to a wider audience?
Right, certainly. Well, I'm saying hello from Brussels, Belgium. And to a certain extent, being in Brussels, Brussels has always had a Belgian colonial population that has come here. And most people think of the Belgian colonial population as being from the Congo, but remember, after World War I, Belgium also received Rwanda and Burundi as colonies. So there's always been Rwandan populations in Belgium. And what's very interesting about these Rwandan populations prior to 1994 is that some of them were fleeing what would be termed as mini genocides, you know, not the one that went off in 1994, but there were sporadic genocides ever since the decolonization of Rwanda. And so you had Rwandan communities here in Belgium. So I've lived in Belgium for over 30 years. And so that was just part of the population mix also with Congolese. When I joined the Yugoslav Tribunal in 1994, the Rwanda Tribunal hadn't been set up. But within 18 months, when the United Nations decided to set up Yugoslavia because of an armed conflict on European soil, and all of a sudden we had a genocide where hundreds of thousands of people were killed, Security Council went back into political action and set up the Rwanda Tribunal. And what they did is they made the Rwanda Tribunal and the Yugoslav Tribunal united. It had the same prosecutor and it shared the same appeals chamber. And because I was at the Yugoslav Tribunal and I was already assigned to be the legal advisor for gender, then that role was just transferred and I did both Rwanda and Yugoslavia at that time. And that's how my involvement within the Rwanda Tribunal began, and several trips back and forth to Kigali.
Great, thank you so much. So then Terry, can I ask you a little bit as well about your experience on the genocide trial? And I'm actually quite curious about kind of what both of your, day-to-day routine was like while you were on these tribunals. What did that involve? I study legal history, but from, the 1500s and the 1600s in France. So it's a little bit different. So I'd like to kind of know, what is that day-to-day experience like?
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me on the panel. And Angela, thank you for this wonderful, wonderful contribution. It certainly was a story that needed to be told. When I first arrived at the tribunals right at the beginning, and the Venezuelan who had been selected as the prosecutor had just resigned to return to the Venezuelan government. So our first legal memorandum was whether or not the deputy prosecutor could even bring a case. It was not a foregone conclusion that the tribunal would even survive. In fact, the first time you arrived, the people there told you to get some tape and put your name on your chair so that the next person coming in wouldn't take it. The resources were slim. We were still pretty much under UN jurisdiction. So the administrator was someone who had come directly from New York. And I recall trying to get a translator for one of our first interviews of a victim. And so I just went in to arrange that with the administrator and ended up spending over an hour trying to explain why we needed a translator. At that point, I was really worried about whether this was going to succeed. Well, fortunately, it grew and we got support, a lot of support from the Dutch, from the Canadians, from the United States. And as we continued our work, we established ourselves as a real entity. One of the interesting things about the Yugoslav and Rwanda tribunals, as Patricia says, they're united. They were united under one prosecutor and one appellate section, but they also had supreme jurisdiction in their cases, which meant that they could trump the sovereignty of individual states. And that's highly, highly unusual. In fact, the United States, without really saying much about it, subverted its sovereignty to the tribunal. actually during the bombing of Serbia, there was a complaint filed against the United States, which was considered by the Yugoslav tribunal and rejected as not sufficiently constituting war crime. But in that instance, the U.S. was actually under the jurisdiction of this tribunal, which had primary jurisdiction. Now, after they tried that experiment, the next time they encountered an opportunity to establish a tribunal in Cambodia and in Sierra Leone, there was immediately a retreat. And it ended up being a tribunal that's known as complementarity, so that there are mechanisms you can use with the ICC, for example, to avoid their jurisdiction. It's only there if the home jurisdiction is unable to prosecute or refuses to prosecute. So anyway, it's good that this tribunal survived. It led to the ICC. I think there's a lot of progress that needs to be made. It's far from perfect. It still doesn't really have total support from the world community. But, you know, we grew. In reality, we were creating a new international criminal system. Mm-hmm. And we borrowed from all the different systems represented. There were Roman systems, criminal justice system, common law systems, hybrids, and a lot of things we had to work out. We had a meeting every Friday, and every Friday it seemed like we had some issue. And I swore that eventually we would entertain some issue where we had agreement. But it never happened. It never even happened when we had a French prosecutor having lunch with a French judge during a trial. And some of us were a little concerned with that. And we brought it up and we discussed it, and we thought there might be agreement, but the French were very adamant. No, we are professionals. And so we ended up not taking action on that. But it was fascinating because so many issues we had to decide, and it was like comparative criminal law every day.
Interesting, thank you. It sounds eerily and strangely familiar to the cases that I study that I said, like, you know, they're from the 1500s, but it's just this continuous issue of overlapping jurisdiction, mixtures of canon law and Roman law and common law, and you know, it seems that no one ever quite knows what they should be doing because there's so many things that are coming together in contrast in these legal systems. So it's interesting to see that long-term connection. So thank you for that. I appreciate that.
Yeah, just one quick example. For example, in the United States, you have a witness that you're going to put on the stand. And of course, with some of these witnesses, they've never even been on an airplane. They've never been out of their village. So you sit down with them, you reassure them, you tell them what questions you're going to ask them, and just prepare them for the testimony. If you do that in the British system, you would be disbarred. Right. You're tampering with the witness.
Right.
So that's just one example of what we had to work out.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing. Great. So now that we have a little bit of kind of a background understanding of what was happening in Rwanda and what kind of these criminal tribunals look like, I'd actually like to turn now to Angela and the people in the play. So Angela, can you kind of share with us maybe how much of these characters are real, or, you know, which people are made up? And then how did you go about creating these fictional characters?
So Agatha, of course, is real. She's based on her real person, and Mbai Jiang, as I mentioned a moment ago, is real. And really, even though there are imagined conversations, I was not a fly on the wall in their houses. I tried to be faithful to their character and so many aspects of them that I really admired and that moved me to write this. Agatha was the mother of 5 children, which was another thing that was kind of compelling for me. It did occur to me that it would be important to show her with one of her children. But having children on stage, as theater professionals know, I mean, you just sort of buy, it's sort of like having children as witnesses in a courtroom. You're just buying yourself a headache if you have children, you know, especially in a drama with this subject matter. So what I did was I gave her an 18-year-old son, who also, you know, has some familial and familiar, I think, mother-son generational tension with her. He's savvy and outspoken, and but also loves his mother very much. So that character was created, but it was created, I hope, in the service of telling a truer story. The female character of Carrie, the UN representative, Agatha did have some very close relationships with members of the UN delegation, and including some of the women. And there were a lot of women, and probably Patricia and Terry know more about this, but one of the things that I observed in my own research is that there were a lot of women who were fairly outspoken about what was going to happen in Rwanda. And there certainly were clues. The fax that was sent to the United States, the so-called genocide fax, there was an article in the New Yorker by Philip Gorovitch, who later wrote a whole book about the genocide, the article was called The Genocide Fax. So the idea that the United States was tipped off, and really, I mean, it was, I have some admiration for both Bill Clinton and Madeleine Albright. This was not their finest hour. And they were tipped off, and there were a lot of things that could have been done that were not done. And so that, I was trying to be honest about that. There's little details, the hairdryer. At the beginning of the play, when Carrie borrows a hairdryer from Agatha, interestingly, Agatha really did hide out in the UN compound when it became clear that her life was in danger on the first night of the genocide. And she had befriended some women who were involved with the UN. Carrie's kind of a composite, right, of a UN officer, a female UN officer from Canada, and also a diplomatic type of person. But there also was an incident where there was a power outage. And I can't remember if I read about this in either Samantha Power's book or Alison DeForge's writing, but there really was an incident when Agatha Uwilingiyimana borrowed a hairdryer from one of the female UN diplomats because a generator went out. And it was just this little tiny, intimate, interpersonal woman-to-woman conversation that I just couldn't resist. So I inverted it to make it the UN person borrowing it from, and she's kind of naive and outspoken herself. The character of Addie, the senior UN peacekeeping force, I mean, he's a little bit inspired by Romeo Dallaire, who really truly had trouble saving his own sanity. And certainly the radio. Radio was an integral part of this genocide. A lot of the propaganda messaging was through the radio. And one of the things that I also read about RTLM, which was the radio station that was the main source of all the hate radio, is that it was really popular. It was not just a source of racist and violent messaging, it was entertainment. And people all over the country were listening to it because of the entertainment value. And so one of the things that I did try to do with the play was be somewhat honest about that. And so I made the radio person kind of hip and stylish and but also just terrifying. And doubling is it's often used in contemporary dramatic writing where you have one actor play two roles. It happens a lot in Angels in America, for example. And in this play, what I did was I had the same actor who is playing the role of the racist radio announcer be a colonel. And there was, I mean, certainly the Rwandan army did not recognize Agatha, and they immediately, it was a little creepy how immediately they took charge of things after that plane crash, and how quickly they blocked UN investigators from the crash site. And I'm sure Terry and Patricia could say more about this, but it's kind of an unresolved question, what really happened on that first night and who was behind that plane crash and who really got advance notice of it. But it certainly worked to the advantage of the genocidaires that this plane crash happened and people couldn't get to the bottom of how it happened.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. Or Terry, could you maybe expand on that point of kind of the state about that plane crash and kind of what is accepted among the legal community or the historical community about that night?
You know, I think my computer is just malfunctioning with my fan. Can you hear that?
Yeah.
Patricia, why don't you take over? And then my fan should be fine in a couple minutes. Let me see if I can fix that.
Yeah, well, to answer that question, it's been very difficult to get to the bottom of who was involved in making the airplane go down. And I know that many theories still run forward. Some say that the French were involved. Some say that there were, other parties that were involved. And there's a famous dossier or file that's found in the locker. And I really appreciate that the play has made us look at that as we're waiting for something to happen. And when will it happen? There's going to be a sign. And this certainly was the sign. I mean, I think with that, there's agreement that this was the sign. The agreement is not completely clear on whether this was a combination of outside Rwandan forces, whether this was Tutsi or Hutu. And I think the fact that you leave it slightly mysterious, but Agathe says, no, we know who this is. It's as if she gets it right away. And I think that that's a nice dramatic point. If you will let me, I want to pull out a couple of legal threads that you've inserted in the play to let you know what happened to them afterwards. So one of the things is that Agathe is a Hutu politician, but she was considered a moderate Hutu. And when the list went out and when the killing began, part of the planning was, and you're very right, this is an extremely planned operation, was to kill off the Tutsis and the moderate Hutu politicians first. And as a matter of fact, it was also a genocide that wanted to, the first wave was to kill the intellectual class off, including politicians. And then the second wave, it was very gendered, was to get to the men. And then the last wave was to get to the females. And that's why you have the females who survive until a certain point in several of the geographical locations. So that shows you a bit of the planning. The other two legal threads I just want to pull out is to let you know that there was the chief of staff of the next president, whose name is Bagasora, and he was tried. And he was convicted, as you mentioned, for the different roadblocks that were set up and for sexual violence that occurred at the roadblocks. So the young girl you have selling the fruit and the staples who was knifed in the shoulder and then sexually violated, a future case, the Bagasora case, finds him guilty for that. And then the last legal thread I would pull out is that a man named Kabanda succeeded Madame Agathe in being president of the country. And he was just arrested about 2 months ago in France. And his trial is now being prepared among the final trials of the Rwanda tribunal, which is now called the Mechanism, that's still going on. So the play from a legal point of view is extremely relevant to see how that hits her as a person and her as a citizen of Rwanda.
Wow, thank you.
Yeah, I think I'm fixed now. So, but I would agree with Patricia that clearly the shooting down of the plane was the signal.
Mhm.
And because that was the signal, the sign, it had to be some way integrated with the Hutu plan, which had been pre-prepared and was just ready to set into action. So we may never know the precise details, but it clearly was the trigger.
Right.
One comment on the Bagasur case is, and Patricia was really instrumental in that case as far as the sexual assaults being included in the case. That was really the first time in history that sexually related crimes were included as part of a genocide. So it's kind of a historical. Oh, that's Akiyesu. Sorry. Yeah, and that was one of the things Patricia was brought on board to do, is to make sure that the sexual assaults and the crimes against the women were not swept under the table. In World War II, they just really didn't pay attention to that. It's interesting though, when you talk to the women as witnesses, many times they would discount their own suffering and say, you really need to look at the men. We're not that we're not as important. What was done to the men is far more serious. So it was really important to have someone like Patricia there to monitor and to remind us that that was a critical element of this genocide and needed to be included.
I think the other thing is that the Rwanda Tribunal is the first international tribunal, or any tribunal, that tries the Genocide Convention, which is, written 40 or 50 years ago in 48. But this is the first court that really puts it to the test. I mean, is this really a convention? Is this really a crime? And right now, when many people try to discount rule of law in Africa, you have to turn to the Rwanda Tribunal. It has the richest trial and appellate jurisprudence of the crime of genocide anywhere in the world. And I think that's overlooked. We run to Yugoslavia like we run to Nuremberg, and we never look at Tokyo like we don't look at Rwanda sometimes.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. Patricia, could you maybe expand on that a little bit and talk about kind of the evolution of recognizing rape or sexual violence as a war crime? And, what have we learned since the Rwandan genocide, and maybe what more is there to learn about this as a crime?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think what's important when we look at here, both Rwanda and Yugoslavia, is that because the Cold War is over, that we have these international courts and tribunals. And the Yugoslav tribunal was not a radical, progressive legal statute. It just played very close to what's called customary law. But even playing very close to that, rape was a crime against humanity that dates from post-Nuremberg. I think part of the innovation, the Yugoslav-Rwanda tribunal, what we did is we realized that the sexual violence, which was really extensive in Yugoslavia and extremely extensive in Rwanda, that we realized that it didn't have to be only charged under an enumerated provision called rape. Sometimes that sexual violence was a form of torture, or sometimes it was a form of other inhumane acts. And so for genocide, it was a form of causing serious bodily and mental harm to members of the group, which is a provision of genocide. I know it sounds very kind of archaic. So in essence, the rape conduct was a form of destroying the Tutsis via serious bodily or mental harm. Since every court and tribunal that's been set up, and now even in national courts that look at international crimes, we look and see where is the sexual violence and how does it inform the overall attack on the civilian population? How does it inform the genocide? The Rwandan judges finally, about 12 years into the tribunal, they made a judicial finding that this genocide was basically composed of two types of crimes, killing and raping. That's how they would characterize the genocide. And so when you look at other, what they refer to as atrocity crimes around the world, today we look at child soldiers and how they've been sexually violated. Now there's been more male rape coming out of the detention camps of Yugoslavia. Some of these men are now in their 60s who are coming forward in the different Bosnian courts. And we know that in the armed conflict in Syria now, that with the detention, that there's been vast amounts of sexual violence committed against mainly males who've been in detention and women who went to find out whether their males were in detention. So we no longer look at the sexual violence as, you know, one rotten soldier running around, or, you know, a frolic and a detour. We look in how it's contextualized and actually part of the harm that was intended to be perpetrated. And I think the AGATHE case from Rwanda really set us off. This is allowed us to say that we can't ignore this, because if we do, we're ignoring the genocide. It wasn't a favor to women, you know, it was a recognition of our legal obligations.
You know, one other aspect of how brutal the rape can be in the context of the genocide, you know, it's obviously to destroy and harm the group, but the thinking that goes on with like individual soldiers is just extremely brutal, because in a lot of communities, if a woman is raped, then she's just thrown aside. She's unclean, she's tainted, no one will marry her, she won't bear children. And so that is an intentional result that some of these groups seek by raping women. Also, it was so brutal that in Yugoslavia, we had instances of after a rape, the soldier saying, now you're going to have a child of my kind, which will replace your kind. So that's just really hard to imagine that people would be even thinking along those lines. But that's why it's so critical to have included this in the overall context.
Right, and I think it also points to the power of having legal participants who are, as you said about Patricia, you know, willing to be there for those victims and to speak up for them. I think that's something that's so important. And I think I'd like now to talk about, because both of you have kind of brought up how this is a systemic movement against women, and how it is, I mean, yes, as you acknowledge, Patricia, it is sexual violence is committed against people of all identities and all genders. But I think something that is really brought forth in this play that Angela discusses is kind of this, the role of feminism and this feminist theme that runs throughout it. So I'd like to turn to that a little bit. And maybe talk a little bit about, this is a question for all of you, an open floor question, but the play really highlights that Agatha, you know, she was a college professor and she was this advocate for women and girls' education long before she was a political figure. So maybe we could discuss a little bit about kind of the role of education and how educating women and girls can be related to the effort to promote world peace, and maybe the path forward for educating women and girls across the globe. So maybe if you have anything to add about that topic.
I think Agatha, I'd love to hear what Patricia has to say in response to this question, but I definitely think that Agatha was prescient on that very issue. And I think that she was genuinely interested in science and learning and all of that. But I also think it's noteworthy that she was a moderate politician. You know, it's not like she had this huge axe to grind or was a revolutionary, or she was a moderate Hutu, but a very firm, unequivocal advocate for the education of women and girls, regardless of their ethnicity, and particularly in the sciences. As she was herself. So I think she was somewhat prescient on that. I mean, now we sort of see the relevance. The other thing before I turn this over to the guests is I just want to highlight for the viewers that there is a wonderful documentary out there called The Uncondemned, which is available streaming on Amazon Prime and probably other sources. That really shows Patricia's wonderful work on the ground in Rwanda and how difficult it was to do what I think we sort of take for granted, the idea that genocide is of course a crime, or that rape and sexual violence is of course a crime of genocide in this context. It was not so easy to persuade an international criminal court of that. And it was particularly difficult to get the victim witnesses to come forward. And Patricia's work was really terrific, and it's beautifully laid out in that documentary. It's Michelle Mitchell is the director and producer, and it's available on Amazon. I think it's called The Uncondemned, and I highly recommend it.
If I could just add, in terms of education, I think you have to realize that Agatha comes up really in the 70s and 80s. And this is a push when women are starting to go to university and a second wave, I would say, okay, post 1960s decolonization, that you have women who are now 18 through 20, late 70s going to school. And so Agatha goes to school. Certainly at that time period, where basically Catholic missionary schools were opening up to women. They were stopping this type of sex segregation in terms of educating girls as much as educating boys. And what, in quotes, development studies always have shown is that if you educate a woman, you're going to have more of the ability to ensure the health of the family, the education of the family, and the earning power of the family. Because women will spend their money on their children. And so when you bring out how, even though Agathe was a professor, her main concern was about saving her children's life, making sure her children were fine. Not that that in any way denigrated her as a woman. She could hold both hats at the same time and see them both as valuable. But I think that the relationship between women and education, as we can see in Rwanda, was absolutely fundamental. Because after the Rwandan genocide, and it's often quoted that Rwanda has as many parliamentarians that are female as Sweden does, or sometimes more, it's because of the education that had started to occur during the 70s and the 80s. And then as a matter of fact, the women in Rwanda after the genocide, among the first times they were allowed to become property owners because the males were dead. And so they had to step into a lot of legal roles that before weren't, that women just couldn't possibly hold. And they did. And then you have to start running ministries. So this education is crucial and fundamental. And it is what helped the country survive the genocide, the education of women. And one reason that Rwanda did not want to become the basket case of Africa, it told itself, if we can survive this, we are a stunning country that goes forward. And it's in many ways, in respect to the educated women who were the majority of the adult population, because as I said before, the men were killed in the second wave. So I just wanted to add that combination of education and other political factors.
Yeah, you answered 3 of my questions in one go. That was great. Thank you.
Well, and the important thing is within Africa and really the whole world, it sets a wonderful example for women in other countries. They look at this and say, my gosh, if they can survive and move on and progress with what they've suffered, we certainly can go forward in our own country.
Right.
Thank you. Yeah. And so then earlier, both of you mentioned kind of the Nuremberg trials. And I think that as a history professor, that's kind of what we turn to when we think about war crimes tribunals. And so I think, Patricia, you mentioned that last month there was someone arrested for suspected war crimes in Rwanda. So maybe could you guys tell us a little bit about like what will be the next steps in these prosecutions? And what else can the audience learn about how these criminal tribunals work that's maybe not obvious from what we get on the news? And again, one of the first questions was talking about what is the day-to-day life like of these lawyers? Well, what will it be like for these people now in 2020?
Excuse me, I want to correct myself, okay? Who was arrested in France last month or 2 months, about 8 weeks ago, was Kabunga. Kabanda, who becomes the president after AGATHE, he comes to the Rwandan tribunal. He doesn't come, he's arrested. He comes to the Rwanda tribunal. And I think what's very interesting, it is the first time that a head of state pleads guilty. He was not put on trial. He pleaded guilty to genocide, and it's due to the prosecutor Louise Arbour. I believe, Terry, you were still there at the same time, to bring forward the first guilty plea, whereas at Nuremberg, there had been a discussion just preceding Nuremberg and from the end of World War I of whether you could try a head of state for international crimes. or did they only owe an obligation to their country and not to the international community? So I think it's very important to know that the president, after Madame AGATHE, comes and pleads guilty, and he says, yes, I'm guilty of having participated and committed that genocide. I mean, it's remarkable. It's what Hitler didn't do. It's what, you know, the Japan prime minister didn't do. And it's almost not until Milosevic comes that you have a head of state that comes and is declared guilty for a genocide.
Wow.
You know, that raises something else that is a challenge for any tribunal, because a tribunal, an international tribunal, does not have a police force.
Right.
It's not like the district attorney's office down the street who has a police force, or the federal government that has half a dozen agencies that can go out and arrest somebody. So when Louise Arbour first came on to the Yugoslav tribunal, we had lots of cases, but they were just on paper and no one would go to arrest anyone. So she filed, we convinced her to file some indictments under seal because we had been announcing even our investigations, which is not a great way to capture somebody once you charge them. But maybe in the early days that was important just to show we were doing something. But when Louise Arbour came on board, we convinced her, let's file some of these under seal. And then she went, and by that time, the former Yugoslavia was in several zones, the French, the British, the US. And Louise went to the heads of those areas and said, we're showing you these indictments. You know where these people are. We expect you to find them, arrest them, and bring them to The Hague. If you don't, in 6 months, I will unseal these indictments and tell the world why I'm unsealing them. So that kind of broke the log jam. I think the first one that got arrested as a result of that was the former mayor of Vukovar, a Serbian, and we tricked him across the border to look at some property and grabbed him as soon as he crossed the bridge. It was a special forces group, I think from Poland, but it was not a group from one of the main powers. And so you can imagine the peer pressure that occurred after that. First of all, the arrest showed that it wasn't going to start World War III. And then you had US forces, British forces, French forces saying, well, look, you know, if they're going to do it, we should do it. And so they started arresting, and we started having trials. What also happened is the fact that you could be arrested and taken to the tribunal became kind of a political weapon for various parties. And some people decided it was in their best interest to surrender to the tribunal. So it changed the dynamics entirely. Otherwise, we'd probably still be sitting there waiting to arrest somebody.
But Tara, you have to remember that I think Mr. Karadzic, he hid out for 20 years. He became a new wave, kind of like guru mystic and
Yeah.
Right. I mean, he was an egomaniac. I think he enjoyed the fact that I'm hiding in plain sight, but you're right.
Right.
He probably had protection, right?
Oh, sure, of course. And not even by just his own people. There's a rumor of a special deal with one country who lost a fighter pilot, was shot down, and there are allegations that there was a special arrangement between that country and Karadzic, not the United States.
Not mention anything, right?
Right. Yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, you know, it's a continued story of intrigue, and I think that it will be very interesting to see how these cases go forward. I have two final questions for you. So the first one would be, have either of you returned to Rwanda or to Kosovo in recent years? And if you have, can you tell us maybe what it feels like to be there now? And how is that different from your previous time there?
Well, I went back to Rwanda. I've been back several times, but more recently, I think was about um, 3 years, 3 years ago. I'd gone back for a conference. Now we had the Rwandan judiciary and prosecutors from Rwanda who continue to do some of their own federal cases for the genocide. So we were meeting with also a group of international criminal lawyers and prosecutors from the Sierra Leone tribunal, also from the Cambodian tribunal. It's from one case that now you see that this is a vibrant area of and then I've been back because I was doing some work in Bukavu, which sits just on the other side of Rwanda. And my impression is this: if there's probably a city in Africa that I wouldn't mind living in, is Kigali. Rwanda has, I think the character brings out, is a beautiful country. It's like being in the Smoky Mountains. The evening temperature and outdoor, it is just perfect. In addition to that, Rwandans are very open, graceful, polite. And I do have to say that many people are struck by this terrible beauty. How can you hold genocide in one hand and the beauty of this country? And so that line from the play is so absolutely true.
Mhm. Thank you.
Yes, I haven't been back, but I still have such vivid memories of my time in Kigali as a consultant. It's just a gorgeous country with rolling hills and 100 different shades of green. I mean, it's kind of like the Eskimo with ice. It's just beautiful. But when I was there, it wasn't too long after the genocide, so it hadn't gelled into this international justice center, and it still was not as safe as it is now. You walked around and you saw red Coca-Cola cans on a stick. Well, that wasn't an economical way for Coca-Cola to advertise. That actually designated a landmine. So you didn't want to kick a can in Rwanda. I was stopped by a 15-year-old with a machine gun who asked me where I was going. And I said, well, I'm just going back to my hotel. And really, why are you asking me? And he said, well, you don't think I have authority? I said, well, you have no identification. He says, you want identification? I'll show you some. So he takes out one of those little paper cards that comes with the wallet when you buy the wallet. And in handwriting is his name and some agency. So I just said, thank you very much. I'll be off now. But it's not the same city it was, thank God, when I was there.
Right. Thank you. Great. So my final question is for Patricia and Terry, and then the same question, but slightly altered for Angela. What kind of advice would you give to either young legal scholars or young historians like myself who are wishing to learn more about war crimes or crimes against humanity? And then for Angela, what advice can you give to young playwrights who are looking to write meaningful and compelling stories like this one?
Well, let me jump in here right away because I'm so happy that a young historian has asked this question, because I have literally said at least dozens of times in the past 3 years that I really wish there were some feminist historians to go back and look at all of the cases, including Nuremberg in Tokyo, that I have here, I've read incessantly, and all of the subsequent trials. And now I don't know any feminist legal historian, and this would contribute so much to erasing the myths of what was there and what was not within those legal holdings, how many females participated in these cases, when, what, when, where, how, and why. So that would be my desire, that there would be 10 of you, and that will become a field.
Thank you.
I would just say there are so many opportunities for historians, lawyers, many stories like Angela has uncovered exist. There are a lot of legal issues that are yet to be resolved. I mean, I've tried over time to convince people in the United States that being a member of like the ICC is not really a threat. If you're undertaking an investigation yourself and it's seriously, the ICC doesn't even have jurisdiction.
Right.
So there are opportunities to develop support worldwide, and legal issues still come up as to what's required. You know, if you're part of a firing squad and you're told you're going to be killed if you don't participate, you know, those types of issues, lots of very intriguing issues. And again, as we both mentioned, we kind of created it as we went along, but that doesn't mean it's set in stone. You know, that's why there's an appellate court, and it's very much a live area of the law for someone to get into at this point.
Thank you. Oh, Angela, you're muted.
I certainly agree with the other comments that there's tremendous opportunity, and partly because there's so much work to be done, right? And there's so much work yet to be done to repair the world and tell stories that need to be told. I also have another career, which is how I know Terry. And what I tell young lawyers is, hopefully you're in law school not just because you want a secure profession, but also because you're a humanist at some level. There's a reason that you chose law school rather than accounting school. And there's a lot, whether it's on a grand scale, as with Patricia and Terry, or even just on a smaller scale, starting a Darfur awareness study group at your local place of worship or in your local community can go a long way to raise awareness and raise money for people who desperately need it. Just to get their basic human needs met, let alone changes in the law. And there is also real opportunity to work on social justice, even if your place of employment is miles and light years away from that. There's always opportunity to participate and help out. And some of the most satisfying things that I've done with my legal knowledge have been in that realm of just getting people together and trying to do something positive, like I think it was the Margaret Mead quote about never doubt that a few people coming together with good intentions can change the world. It's the only thing that ever has. And I think that's a valid comment. In terms of young writers, and I'm still learning myself. I do believe it's important to read, and that's kind of my best advice for people who aspire to be better writers, whether it's in the legal profession or in literature or the arts. I think it's really important to read and to be a good consumer of the arts. I think we need the arts. And one of the sort of silver linings, although it's high, one of the things that has come out of this pandemic, if you will, is that many, many theaters and arts organizations have, of course, shut down because there was no choice. Broadway shut down. Locally here in Los Angeles, the Hamilton musical was scheduled to open in April. It never did. So many arts organizations have gone completely dark. But a few very courageous institutions, including PlayFest Santa Barbara and the Road Theater Company, have bravely, I would say, because when you do something new, there's all kinds of ways that it can go wrong, have bravely stepped into the void and tried to make art happen. And a lot of it's free. This broadcast is being aired free of charge. This discussion is going to be aired free of charge. And so there is there is opportunity, even in this crazy and tragic and difficult time of the pandemic. There is opportunity to be a consumer of the arts. And we know from history, some of the most important works of all time were written during times of plague and times of enormous human difficulty. And so I think it's important to read and be consumers of the arts. And in some ways, I think that'll make us better human beings and better able to engage in the issues that we care about.
Right. Thank you. Yeah, it sounds like the uniting message is that there is more to be done. And what I try to constantly tell my students and constantly tell myself is that there's always more to read, the never-ending journey of reading. So that's the end of my questions. I'd just like to thank you all so much. It was such an honor to speak with all of you. And again, congratulations to Angela on the completion of such a compelling story. And I believe that the play will continue to be streamed through tomorrow, November 23rd, until 9 p.m. So with that, I will turn us back over to Michael, and thank you again.
Thank you.
First of all, on behalf of PlayFest Santa Barbara, thank all of you for this extraordinary conversation we've had today in response to and inspired by Angela's extraordinary statement about what happened to particular people in a particular time. And that's one of the powers that, the power of theater, the power of art, whether it's visual or music or dance or even theater, which is my medium and PlayFest medium, is to tell our stories. And there is a particular reason why Agatha is our honorary play, and because it is so powerful in speaking to the human experience. And this is one of the things that I just want to share as we get into closing, is that PlayFest Santa Barbara is dedicated to the development of new plays and playwrights. And so if this work by Angela inspires you to write your own story or reflect on the story of the world around you, then we have been successful. We don't produce fully developed plays. We help to develop the plays with the intention of helping them get out into the world to be fully realized productions. This play that Angela has created at this time is very worthy, extremely worthy of having a life beyond the readings. There is a phrase called reading to death, that plays just keep getting readings and they're never actually fully produced. And so we encourage anyone out there who may have an opportunity to support the furtherance of this play and to have it realized on stage in a full production. We'll help you get in touch with Angela. So I also want to acknowledge that this is not her first play that PlayFest has looked at. She also has another tremendous play, again, the Spanish Prayer Book, if I remember the title correctly, Angela, which was an extraordinary play that the Road Theater Company, apparently PlayFest and the Road Theater Company shares a similar aesthetic in terms of our interest in work, because it had been a finalist in a previous year, which is how I was first introduced to Angela. And now this, her play, Agatha, comes by and just tremendously impressed us. So if there is, as Angela said, we're all having our own struggles out there. If anybody would like to donate to support our mission to help make sure that playwrights such as Angela have the opportunities to have their voices heard and their work developed, please go to our website and also see what other work we've done in the past, which is playfestsantabarbara.org, of course. There's a PayPal link there, should you choose to do so. And again, I just want to say thank you very, very much, Angela, for the work that you did, Chloe for moderating, and Patricia and Terry being very much extraordinary guests for us. So with that, I'm going to stop our recording and we'll go offline. So again, we're showing Agatha streaming until 9 o'clock on the 23rd in 2020. All right. Thank you all, everybody.
I'll stay on to talk to you for a moment if you want. Is the recording stopping?
I'm going to stop that when I find the right button here. Hold on.